The following program includes sexually explicit references that may not be appropriate for all audiences. Viewer discretion advised. It is a form of intimate relationships that's more common than most people may think, and it has been described as consensual, ethical, and responsible non-monogamy. Dr. Elisabeth Sheff is widely considered the expert on the topic, polyamory. She's the author of The Polyamorous Next Door and Stories from the Polycule, Real Life in Polyamorous Families, as well as When Someone You Love is Polyamorous, Understanding Poly People and Relationships. Exploring polyamory, the topic of this edition of Love Maps. Love Maps couples and relationship counselor Elaine Wilco sat down with Elisabeth Sheff, Ph.D., to talk about that once taboo topic.
You are quite an expert in this subject. You've written several books, you've published several articles, you've done research. Maybe we should start off by just talking about what is polyamory? What does that word mean?
Polyamory is a form of consensual non-monogamy that emphasizes emotional connection as opposed to, for instance, swinging, which is also a form of consensual non-monogamy that emphasizes sexual variation. So polyamory allows people sexual variation, but not as the primary goal. Emotional connection and falling in love with multiple people is generally the primary goal.
Falling in love with multiple people.
Yes.
Falling in love with multiple people. Okay.
Openly and consensually on a negotiated discussion, talking about making sure everything's out in the open.
So these are really some key words here. Consensual, non-monogamy. Okay, so what does that mean? Consensual, non-monogamy.
So consensual means that it's negotiated first, beforehand. People talk about, for instance, safer sex agreements. How are they going to handle having sex with multiple partners, either simultaneously or far more often consecutively? And negotiating, so not only safer sex agreements, but time and money and emotions and who's going to take care of the kids and who's going to be out of town and who's dating when, things like that. So consensual means very well discussed, explored, explained, and that everyone knows what's happening. It's above board.
Everyone knows what's happening. So that's how it's really kind of different from other non-consensual kinds of non-monogamy.
Absolutely. Like, for instance, cheating is not consensual because someone is pretending to be monogamous but not actually acting monogamous, and someone else thinks they're in a monogamous relationship and is probably acting monogamously, thinking their partner is also acting monogamously, but they haven't discussed having an open relationship. So cheating is clandestine, dishonest, not discussed, not openly conducted.
So you're talking about a lot of communication going on between everybody who's involved.
Absolutely. One of the primary hallmarks of polyamory is that people, they even have, how the real estate agents say location, location, location. The polyamorous say communicate, communicate, communicate. That's their kind of poly mantra is what they call it.
Poly mantra.
And not just communicate, but communicate honestly. Honesty is very important if you want people to trust you. And in open relationships, trust is key. Trust is very important for the maintenance of an ongoing relationship. If you're in an open relationship and you feel like you can't really trust your partner to, for instance, maintain the safer sex agreements they've made with you, then you're going to be nervous about, if that person is going out and having sex with other people, you're probably not going to want to have unprotected sex with them if you feel like they can't live up to their safer sex agreements. So trust, honest communication and trust, living up to agreements, negotiating openly before you do anything, and then living up to safer sex or emotional agreements, things like that, create the setting for trust, and that makes poly relationships go much better.
This sounds really quite challenging. I mean, we're talking about, and it sounds complicated, we're talking about trust, we're talking about negotiations, we're talking about talking a lot.
Yes, absolutely. In fact, there's a lot more talking than sex for a lot of the poly folks. It's not simply a giant orgy for everyone. For one thing, they'll have group sex occasionally, but group sex is not their primary focus generally for most poly people. And they spend so much time negotiating and talking about feelings and talking about how things are going for them that they don't have a ton of sex. Some polyamorous don't have sex with each other at all. They'll have emotional relationships with each other. And I call those, poly people make up words all the time to describe things in their experience that the English language doesn't describe. So I call that emotional relationship. As part of a polyamorous relationship, I call that polyaffective relationships instead of polyamorous relationships.
So you're really putting the emphasis on, or polyamory puts the emphasis on emotions, having emotional relationships with lots of people, or let's say more than just one other person. So it's not all about sex, because of course that's what we're thinking when we think about people wanting to have a non-monogamous relationship. We're talking about being non-monogamous in your emotions, in your feelings, in the way that you connect with other people.
Absolutely. It is kind of a different worldview than a monogamous worldview that says there's only this much love and it has to be exclusive or it's not real. In the polyamorous worldview, love is an infinite thing. Loving one person doesn't mean you have less love for someone else. Time, unfortunately, is finite. So spending time with one person actually does mean you might not have that time to spend with someone else. So the polyamorists talk a lot more about juggling schedules and things like that than emotional primacy. Actually, a lot of people, when they very first start polyamory, especially if they're starting as a couple, they do have this emotional hierarchy thing, kind of a leftover from monogamy where...
So where there's a primary couple.
Exactly.
And then there's a third person who's added or a fourth person who's added. That's what you mean by emotional primacy.
Yes, and that whoever is added, like the couple is the real relationship, and whoever is added is kind of discretionary, possibly disposable, and that tends to be just a disaster. The emotional primacy, trying to make rules around how much you can love someone, doesn't work in the long run. Leads to all sorts of complications, and many people who stay in very long-term polyamorous relationships let go of the idea of a primary partner who's the real one, who's the stable long-term, and then a secondary partner who's maybe not as important. They will let go of that and just have independent relationships with people in their lives and not compare them on levels of importance.
So this is not the same as a couple that decides to have a threesome with somebody who they have just picked up. And it's not the same as just having open marriage. How is this different from an open marriage?
Sometimes it could be an open marriage. The word open is kind of an umbrella category that covers all sorts of non-monogamous relationships. Open doesn't give you a lot of information except that they're not monogamous. So they might be monogamish, for instance, which is primarily monogamous with a little bit of wiggle room to make out with other people, maybe even have sex with other people, but really have the couple as the primary unit with little dalliances on the side. That might be an open relationship. Swingers often think of themselves in open relationships. they tend to have briefer sexual encounters with others. Some swingers have rules about not developing feelings for other people. So, for instance, some swingers will have a 3 strikes and you're out rule, that you can have sex with someone else up to 3 times, but then you cannot keep seeing that person because you might become attached to them.
So they're really trying to avoid any kind of emotional involvement.
Absolutely.
Whereas when we talk about really polyamory, we're talking about cultivating emotional involvement.
But swinging is really diverse. Some swingers swing with the same people for 15, 20 years, and from the outside as a researcher, that looks to me like polyamory. You know, they know each other, they go on vacations together, their kids know each other, they go to each other's holiday celebrations. That looks like polyamory, but because they think of it as swinging, it's legitimately swinging. Like, it's not up to me to decide, to tell them, oh no, you're actually poly, you're not really swingers. So the definitions are a little mushy, especially with swinging and polyamory. In fact, there's this overlap in between where it's not clear which is which. So Ken Haslam, who is a polyamorous activist, made up the word swally to describe that middle ground of swinging and poly, swally, which I thought was just hilarious.
So you like these, the idea of using what we've got and kind of creating the words that we need to describe what's going on, because maybe we just don't even have kind of the social structures that are already set and the words that go along with it to describe the variety of human experience.
Well said.
So I want to ask you, you talked about as a researcher, and you've done a lot of research. How did you get interested in this area?
As an intellectual, I intellectualize things that frighten me. And I had a partner that I met when I was 22, and he told me right away he didn't want to be monogamous and he didn't want to get married. And at the time, I was not taking him seriously as a partner. I didn't think that he and I would end up together at all. I was like, oh, I'm just gonna mess with this dude until I get back to real relationships with women. You know, like men are kind of disposable, easy come, easy go. Fine. He doesn't want to be monogamous, whatever, freak, is what I thought. Then I fell in love with him, and it ended up being a really big deal to me. Suddenly, this idea that he never wanted to be monogamous, never wanted to get married, but he wanted to have children and build a life together, I just kind of couldn't see
So he wanted
how that would
he
work.
wanted to have a relationship with you.
Yes.
But not a monogamous relationship.
And not a married relationship. And I was just like, well, so how do I know what to expect from you then? Or what kind of commitment is there? Or how
does it all work?
How does it all work? And truthfully, when he said to me he wanted to be non-monogamous, I heard, you're too fat and you're bad in bed, which is what a lot of people hear when their partners say, honey, I want to be non-monogamous. So actually, a lot of people think that they're too fat or they're not a good lover or somehow they're not enough. The partner who gets it sprung on them, you know, that their other partner wants to be non-monogamous. Then that partner who's used to monogamy is thinking, well, how come I'm inadequate somehow? Why do you need other people? And he kept trying to explain it to me that it wasn't inadequacy on my part. And I didn't really get that from him. It took finding other people in non-monogamous relationships and asking them, how do you manage this? How do you maintain this? You know, I'm really afraid of this. This is completely freaking me out. How do you do this? You know, you seem to be fine with it and I'm over here like a quivering mess. And so talking to them over years, it became really clear to me that for some people, polyamory is a form of sexual orientation, that they talk about themselves as being wired for multiple partners. And for some people, it's a lifestyle that's more a matter of choice than being kind of hardwired.
So they can do it. They can be monogamous, but they much prefer to be polyamorous.
For the lifestyle people, yes. For the people who are polyamorous by sexual orientation, they can occasionally maintain monogamy for periods of time, but they talk about it like wearing shoes that are 3 sizes too small. Like you can smash your foot in there and walk around in it for a few minutes, but it's gonna break your foot and it's not gonna be comfortable and it's not gonna be sustainable. So monogamy feels like that to them, a shoe that's 3 sizes too small. And being polyamorous feels much more natural to them.
We hope you'll still be here when Love Maps returns.